Chaos erupts on Capitol Hill as FBI Director Kash Patel clashes with Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett in a searing hearing over her incendiary remarks targeting Elon Musk. Accusations of political violence, arson, and hypocrisy ignite a brutal showdown. The room was tense, more tense than usual for a congressional oversight hearing. Cameras clicked, pens scribbled, and aides leaned forward with eyes glued to the unfolding scene. The air itself buzzed with anticipation as the House Oversight Committee convened for what was supposed to be a standard hearing on domestic security threats. It didn't stay standard for long. At the center of the storm stood Kash Patel, director of the FBI, former national security prosecutor, and a man known for his precision, poise, and an almost surgical ability to dismantle obfuscation. From him, Texas Representative Jasmine Crockett, clad in her signature bold-colored suit, sat with a mixture of defiance and forced calm. What had sparked the firestorm was a collection of remarks Crockett had made just days earlier. Remarks that would come to define one of the most combative hearings in recent political memory. Elon Musk must be taken down. That, she had declared during a fiery rally in Dallas, her voice echoing through the speakers, followed by an even more controversial statement. This man is a threat to equity. If we have to burn down the symbols of his empire to make a point, then so be it. It's time he got what's coming to him. Within 48 hours of her speech, a Tesla dealership in Phoenix, Arizona had gone up in flames. 3 suspects, now in federal custody, were found with manifestos directly quoting Crockett's rhetoric. Though Crockett vehemently denied any direct connection, the FBI's investigation into the incident had taken a sharper turn. And today, Patel was there to make it clear that consequences were coming. Crockett entered the chamber with her trademark mix of swagger and self-righteousness, ready to defend herself, ready to play offense. But Patel wasn't interested in theater. He had come prepared, with transcripts, surveillance footage, and a chilling warning. The remarks made by the Congresswoman, Patel began, his voice steady, didn't just echo in the chambers of rhetoric, they traveled. They found ears, and 3 of those ears belonged to individuals now facing domestic terrorism charges. Words matter, Representative Crockett, especially when you're holding the microphone. Crockett responded with a rehearsed calm. As a black woman in America, I've faced scrutiny my entire life for simply speaking truth to power. I will not be silenced because certain people feel threatened by a woman who stands up for justice. Patel didn't flinch. Respectfully, Congresswoman, this has nothing to do with your identity and everything to do with the consequences of incendiary language. Invoking your identity to shield yourself from accountability is not only disingenuous, it's dangerous. He leaned forward, placing a thick dossier on the desk before him. Inside were reports linking Crockett's quotes to an increasing number of online forums advocating violence against Tesla properties. He read aloud a line from one of the suspects. She said, "Burn it down." So we did. The room went silent. Crockett bristled but held her ground. You're twisting my words to fit a narrative. I'm calling out corporate greed and unchecked power, not encouraging violence. That's not what the transcript says, Patel replied. You said, and I quote, if we have to burn down the symbols of his empire to make a point, then so be it. That's not nuance, Congresswoman. That's gasoline. The verbal blows kept coming. Patel exposed her long history of controversial statements, pivoting next to an incident from just a few weeks ago where Crockett mocked Texas Governor Greg Abbott, calling him Hot Wheels, during a college panel discussion, a crass reference to his paralysis after a tragic accident decades ago. She didn't apologize, Patel said flatly. She doubled down. That's not strength. That's cruelty posing as activism. Crockett interjected, this time more flustered. You don't get to lecture me about morality, Mr. Patel. As a black woman, again with respect, Patel's cut in. You don't get to hide behind identity politics while mocking a disabled man and excusing arson. This isn't about who you are. It's about what you've done. You want to talk about justice? Justice starts with accountability. And if you're unwilling to hold yourself to the standard you expect from others, then what exactly are you? Leading? Murmurs rippled through the chamber. Committee members shifted in their seats. A few aides nervously exchanged glances. Crockett adjusted her mic. The real issue here is how Elon Musk has weaponized technology against the marginalized. I spoke truth. If a few people take that the wrong way, that's on them, not me. Patel nodded slightly, like a chess player recognizing a bad move from across the board. That kind of abdication of responsibility is exactly how violence festers, he said. You didn't just speak, you ignited. And when the fire started burning, literally, you walked away. This hearing isn't about Elon Musk. It's about the people you're supposed to serve. And it's about the rule of law. He turned toward the chair of the committee. And the rule of law cannot bend to fit the emotions of those in power. Outside the Capitol, protesters chanted. Inside, Patel's words hung heavy in the air like smoke after a fire. What had started as a hearing on domestic extremism had exploded into a raw confrontation over truth, power, and the price of rhetoric in an age of outrage. And Patel wasn't finished. As he reached for the next folder in his pile, labeled Political Coordination, Evidence Thread, the room tensed again. What he was about to unveil, according to sources close to the FBI, would link not just Crockett's statements, but her staff's digital communications to anonymous social media accounts that had glorified the dealership fires and encouraged further symbolic actions. Crockett's composure flickered for the first time. This was no longer just a war of words. It was about to get much deeper and much darker. The murmurs in the hearing room had given way to an almost eerie silence. Phones were still, cameras locked in place. The eyes of the nation, through live streams, broadcasts, and breaking news alerts, were focused squarely on one man and one folder. Kash Patel tapped the stack gently with one finger, then opened it. Congresswoman Crockett, he said, his voice crisp and deliberate. This next segment may be difficult to hear, but I suggest you listen closely, because when we talk about political violence, we're not speaking in abstract terms. We're talking about the deliberate cultivation of an environment where fire becomes a form of expression, and destruction is rebranded as activism. He slid out a series of printed screenshots, images, posts, usernames, each one more damning than the last. Our forensics division, Patel continued, has traced anonymous social media activity tied to the Twitter account Strike Back Now, which surfaced just hours after your Dallas speech. That account posted multiple incendiary statements praising the arson at the Phoenix Tesla dealership, including a message that read, and I quote, "The revolution has wheels, Tesla wheels, and we're torching them one by one." Thank you, Congresswoman. Crockett leaned back, expression unreadable. Her aides huddled slightly closer, whispering furiously behind her. Patel pressed on. Our analysis linked the metadata on those posts to a device registered under a congressional staff Wi-Fi network, specifically your Dallas office. Gasps. Audible now. I'm not saying you ordered anyone to commit a crime, Congresswoman, Patel clarified. But there's a pattern here. A culture being nurtured under your watch. Calls to burn down institutions. Mockery of a disabled governor. The vilification of a private citizen who, whether you agree with him or not, has committed no crime. Crockett's mic flicked on with a click. Her voice, now sharper, almost accusatory. So, let me get this straight. You're using social media posts from anonymous accounts and blaming me for arson? This is a hearing, not a witch trial. And again, as a black woman in America, Patel cut in without raising his voice. Being a black woman does not absolve you of incitement, Congresswoman. She slammed her palm on the desk. Don't you dare speak to me like that. I'll speak to you as the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, tasked with investigating threats to national security, including threats stemming from politically charged rhetoric that escalates into violence. Chairman Halverson banged the gavel for order. The room was devolving into chaos, some members shouting, others demanding a recess. But the cameras were rolling, and Patel wasn't stepping back. In the weeks leading up to the Phoenix arson, he said over the noise, we've documented 5 separate instances of vandalism, property destruction, and fire-related incidents at Tesla locations nationwide. In every one of those cities, Congresswoman, local activists quoted your speech. Verbatim. Crockett's tone turned icy. You're twisting this into a narrative. Let me tell you what the real violence is. The real violence is the economic oppression Elon Musk enables. The real violence is the silence when people like me speak up. I said what I said because someone had to. And if people are angry, good. Be angry. Anger isn't the issue, Patel responded. Action is. And when that action turns to flames and federal indictments, the conversation shifts. We are no longer debating free speech. We are investigating material support for acts of domestic terrorism. The word terrorism echoed through the chamber like a gunshot. Crockett shook her head slowly. So now I'm a terrorist? Is that what this is? No, Patel said firmly. You're a federal lawmaker, which is exactly why your words carry more weight and more risk than most. If you incite, and people act on it, the law doesn't care about your intentions. It cares about outcomes. He turned again to the documents. The Justice Department has authorized charges against 3 suspects. One of them, Marcus Lynn, a 21-year-old from Flagstaff, told agents that he acted after watching clips of your speech stitched into a TikTok montage, glorifying the fire. The clip ends with your voice. It's time he got what's coming to him. That was the last thing played before the fire started. Patel let that sink in. Whether or not you lit the match, Congresswoman, he said, his tone grave, your words were the spark. Crockett, visibly rattled now, glanced around the room. Few of her Democratic colleagues were rushing to her. Defense. There were side eyes. Tension. An awareness that the political cost of standing with her might be too steep this time. Still, she fought back. And where was this energy when right-wing extremists stormed the Capitol? She snapped. Where was this obsession with accountability then? Patel nodded slightly. Excellent point. You're right to raise it. I personally oversaw multiple investigations related to January 6th. We arrested over 1,000 individuals. We're prosecuting them without hesitation. But I would ask you, are we applying that same standard here? Or are some forms of violence considered more acceptable than others depending on who's speaking? There it was. The moment the entire room seemed to freeze. You've built a brand around moral outrage, Patel said. And yet when you mock a disabled man, Governor Abbott, calling him Hot Wheels, as though his injury is punchline material, you deflect. When you're asked to clarify your incendiary remarks, you retreat into identity. And when fires burn, and people quote you as inspiration, you deny. You do not lead with truth. You lead with performance. Crockett stood now, knocking over her chair slightly. I don't need a lecture from you on leadership. I fight for people who have been ignored their whole lives. And who fights for the innocent small business employees whose lives were put at risk when a dealership went up in flames? Patel countered. Who speaks for the immigrant security guard injured in that fire, who was pulled from the wreckage, with second-degree burns? Was that part of the revolution too? Her jaw tightened. The silence that followed was heavier than anything said. Patel sat back slightly, voice calm now, but deadly precise. Congresswoman Crockett, You must tread carefully. The administration has already classified attacks on critical infrastructure, including Tesla facilities, as potential acts of domestic terrorism. The Justice Department has made it clear, those who inspire, enable, or excuse such violence will face scrutiny. You are not above that scrutiny. No one is. Before she could respond, Chairman Halverson raised his hand. We'll take a 10-minute recess, he said, though everyone knew the hearing had just hit its peak. As Patel organized his folders, eyes still locked on Crockett, a different energy settled in the room. Not the fire and fury of partisan sparring, but the slow burn of something more unsettling. The realization that the real story was just beginning settled like a storm cloud over the hearing room. 10 minutes of recess felt like a silent eternity. Kash Patel remained seated, flipping methodically through a fresh set of documents, each page brimming with evidence that hadn't yet seen daylight. Jasmine Crockett had retreated into a huddle with her aides, visibly shaken but still refusing to lose face. Her posture was rigid, her jaw tight, her voice low and clipped as she spoke with her staff. Outside, protesters clashed, chants in support of Crockett's fight against corporate colonization on one side, while on the other, demonstrators held signs reading, "Justice for Tesla workers," and "Words have consequences." The building pulsed with tension. When the gavel dropped again and the hearing resumed, it wasn't the same hearing anymore. It had evolved, or rather devolved, into something darker, deeper. This wasn't about Tesla anymore. It wasn't even about Crockett's remarks. It had become an inquiry into power, responsibility, and the weaponization of influence. Patel was already speaking before most had even settled into their chairs. Before the break, he began, I emphasized the role rhetoric plays in escalating violence. But let's be clear, we're not just dealing with rhetorical consequences anymore. We're now confronting coordinated digital behavior aimed at inciting real-world harm. He held up a printed message, enlarged for the room. This post, Patel said, pointing to the timestamp, was made by a burner account registered to the same IP address as a device linked to the Congresswoman's senior communications advisor. It reads, "It's time for smoke. These billionaire monuments need to fall. Dallas, you're up next." That was posted less than 24 hours before a firebomb was discovered at a Tesla supercharging station in Oak Cliff. Thankfully, it didn't detonate. Crockett jolted forward, her mic live. "That's not evidence. That's guilt by proximity, and you know it," Patel nodded. "Correct, but proximity matters when violence follows. The Justice Department now considers coordinated digital incitement a prosecutable offense under the Domestic Security Act revisions passed last year. There was a low rumble of whispered reactions from committee members. Patel leaned forward. "I'm not here to score political points. I'm here because Americans are being harmed, and because the culture of impunity in this building is reaching dangerous levels." Crockett's temper flared. "You don't get to come in here and moralize. You're the head of an institution with its own history of political targeting. Let's not pretend the FBI is some beacon of fairness." A few Democrats nodded in agreement, but even that support felt tentative. Patel didn't blink. "We have our history, but we also have a mission. And that mission is to protect Americans from threats, foreign and domestic. That includes rogues, ideologues, whether they wear MAGA hats or congressional pins." The line hit hard. He turned another page. "I'd like to introduce Exhibit 12 into the record, a recorded phone call intercepted with a legal warrant between one of the Phoenix arson suspects and an unidentified associate. In that call, the suspect says, quote, 'She gave us the words. We just put them into action.' We believe the associate may be linked to an activist group that received funding through a passee affiliated with the Congresswoman's office." Crockett's face twitched ever so slightly. Patel caught it. "That pass," he continued, "donated nearly $50,000 to organizations that have publicly glorified the arson attacks as Justice in action. Those are not just inconvenient optics, Congresswoman. That's a paper trail. Crockett exhaled sharply into her mic. Do you know how many organizations get money from political PACs? You can't lay every action at my feet. You're building a RICO case on vibes and Twitter threads. Patel nodded. And yet here we are. 3 federal indictments, 5 linked attacks, 1 intercepted explosive device, and multiple confirmed digital footprints leading back to your orbit. This isn't a witch hunt, it's accountability. And you are standing in the center of the fire. The chamber was on edge. Even the chairman seemed hesitant to interrupt. This was no longer a routine oversight hearing. It had the atmosphere of a courtroom, and Patel had assumed the role of prosecutor. Then he dropped the next bomb. We've also discovered internal emails, he said, sliding several printed pages into the record. These were obtained through subpoena. Emails between members of your team, referring to your Dallas speech beforehand as a chance to set the streets ablaze, metaphorically or literally. One aide even jokes, "Let's hope we don't go full Hunger Games." The laughter that had followed that comment in the email thread, documented, dated, and authenticated, suddenly looked grotesque under the hearing room lights. Crockett didn't speak this time. She stared at the paper being passed around the dais. Her hands were clasped tightly on the desk now, knuckles pale. Patel's voice lowered. You want to talk about systemic oppression? Let's talk about the immigrant mechanic in Phoenix who lost his job because of the fire, or the Latina single mother who relied on that dealership's childcare program while she worked as a receptionist. Your revolution didn't liberate them. It wrecked their lives. The impact was undeniable. No shouting now. Just the suffocating weight of implication. And then, as if peeling back another layer, Patel pivoted. Let me ask you this, Congresswoman, he said, now quieter, deadlier. Is this about justice or relevance? Crockett looked up, startled. Because from where I sit, he continued, it seems like every outrage, every headline, every reckless quote, it's not about the people, it's about you. Staying in the news, feeding the machine, building a brand. There's a difference between activism and opportunism. And the moment fire was used as a megaphone, you stopped being a legislator and started being something else. Entirely, Crockett responded slowly, carefully now. You don't get to define my motives. You don't know my life. You don't know my people. Patel didn't smile. No, but I know the law. And right now, the law is looking straight at you. As he reached for the final folder of the day, its tab labeled Internal Referral, DOJ Oversight Council, Pending Review. The room shifted again. The term internal referral wasn't just bureaucratic jargon. It meant that the FBI was considering formal charges. At the very least, it meant Crockett's conduct had crossed a threshold that could no longer be ignored behind closed doors. And just as Patel opened it, the chairman called for a second recess. The moment felt choreographed. Maybe to protect the process. Maybe to shield Crockett from a full implosion. But the damage was done. This wasn't political theater anymore. This was something else. And in the quiet that followed, as chairs scraped against the marble floor and aides scrambled to triage the fallout, one thing became terrifyingly clear. The walls were closing in. And Jasmine Crockett knew it. She stood, just outside the chamber during the second recess, barely acknowledging the aide at her side, reading rapid-fire updates into her ear. Her eyes were fixed straight ahead, blinking, barely breathing, trying to make sense of how quickly the tide had turned. She had entered the hearing prepared to spar, to grandstand, to play offense. But she hadn't expected this level of precision. Not from Kash Patel. Inside, Patel remained at the table, calm, untouched by the chaos swirling around him. His demeanor hadn't changed. Not when Crockett raised her voice. Not when protesters outside the Capitol screamed for his resignation. not even when accusations of racial targeting started echoing across social media. That was the difference. Crockett played to the crowd. Patel played to the facts. And the facts, now weaponized into a carefully coordinated offensive, were swallowing Crockett whole. When the recess ended and the hearing resumed, the air had turned electric. It wasn't just tension. It was anticipation. Something was coming. Patel's hands hovered above the final folder, the one labeled Internal Referral, DOJ Oversight Council, pending review. The phrase was bureaucratic, yes, but the implication was seismic. A referral meant the Department of Justice was reviewing evidence to determine whether a sitting member of Congress should be investigated, possibly charged. Patel began without preamble. Madam Chair, members of the committee, for the final portion of my testimony today, I am entering into the record a series of materials submitted to the Justice Department's Oversight Council under classified cover. These include encrypted communications obtained through warrant, intercepted digital transfers, and sworn statements from former employees of Representative Crockett's office. He paused to let the weight of those words settle. These materials strongly suggest a willful disregard for the consequences of insightful rhetoric and a pattern of conduct that may rise to the level of criminal negligence, or worse, direct incitement under federal law. Crockett snapped to attention. Her mic came on, voice trembling with fury. You want to arrest me for what? Speaking out? Criticizing a billionaire who's done nothing but exploit workers and destabilize our democracy through unchecked power? You're setting a precedent that punishes truth-tellers. You're not on trial for telling the truth, Patel replied coolly. You're being scrutinized for inciting criminal acts and fostering an environment where political violence is tolerated, even celebrated. And who decides that? Crockett shot back. You? The same FBI that's ignored threats against progressive lawmakers for years? We investigate all threats, Patel said. But when a public official's own words become the threat, the calculus changes. The room went still again as Patel laid out the newest and possibly most damning revelation. One of your former digital strategy consultants, Sarah Weller, has submitted a sworn affidavit describing internal planning meetings where staff discussed ways to trigger online unrest. In her statement, she alleges that you approved a campaign designed to fan the flames of anti-Musk sentiment for political capital. Crockett's face went blank. Patel continued. We have metadata from burner accounts seeded by that campaign. They encouraged followers to take bold, symbolic actions against Tesla and Musk-affiliated entities. Weller further claims that when concerns were raised internally about legal ramifications, they were dismissed by your chief of staff, who allegedly said, and I quote, "Let the FBI try to prove it." A collective gasp echoed across the room. Crockett finally spoke, her tone slower now, more deliberate. You're going to trust a disgruntled ex-staffer trying to save her own skin? She's one of three, Patel replied. The second document he slid across the desk bore the name of a field organizer from Crockett's 2022 campaign, Andre Dubose, who had provided signed testimony confirming discussions where violent protest was considered an acceptable escalation to raise the Congresswoman's national profile. Andre Dubose has also cooperated with the Bureau, Patel said. He provided chat logs, internal documents, and even a draft version of your Dallas speech, with handwritten edits in the margins, edits that include crossing out the word disrupt and replacing it with the word destroy. Patel glanced up. Is that your handwriting, Congresswoman? No comment, she muttered. He leaned back, letting the silence speak. This hearing began as a discussion about accountability. It has evolved into something far more serious. The American public deserves to know if their elected officials are complicit in stoking domestic terrorism under the guise of social justice. Chairman Halverson finally intervened, his voice strained. Director Patel, are you confirming that the Department of Justice is reviewing potential criminal referrals? Yes, Patel replied without hesitation. And if the evidence continues to align, charges may follow, not just against fringe actors, but potentially against sitting officials who knowingly incited violence. Crockett exploded. This is a political hit job. You're trying to criminalize dissent. You're afraid of women like me. Black, outspoken, unafraid. Patel looked her dead in the eye. No, Congresswoman. I'm afraid of what happens when someone in your position confuses provocation with leadership. You're not being targeted because of who you are. You're being held accountable because of what you've done. She stood again, voice booming. You're trying to silence me. No, Patel said calmly. I'm trying to stop people from getting killed. The words landed like a gavel of their own. Heavy, irrefutable. The chairman called the session to recess again, but it didn't matter. The news had already broken. Reporters were filing stories from the back of the chamber. Phones buzzed across the room. The Justice Department's official comment had just gone live. All evidence submitted by the FBI director is under active review. No one is above the law. As Crockett stormed out of the room, trailed by her staff, a cameraman caught the moment she turned and glared over her shoulder at Patel. You'll regret this, she mouthed. He didn't respond. He just closed the folder and stood, quietly gathering his papers as the walls around Crockett began to crumble. But outside the chamber, beyond the cameras and microphones, the fuse she lit was still burning, and it hadn't reached the end yet. As the hearing room emptied into chaos, the world outside Capitol Hill was already beginning to convulse. Every major news network interrupted programming with the same banner headline. FBI Director Patel submits criminal referral against Representative Jasmine Crockett. Domestic terror, links alleged. Social media detonated. Hashtags trended globally. Crockett exposed. Elon Arsongate. Kash Patel delivers. Inside the Capitol, Patel moved like a man already several steps ahead. No celebratory nods. No camera grandstanding. He simply exited the room, his face unreadable, his documents locked underarm like a sealed verdict. For him, this wasn't political. It was surgical. The kind of operation you conduct when the infection's deep, and the scalpel is your only option. But for Jasmine Crockett, this wasn't just a scandal. It was a war. She returned to her office in a flurry of motion, staffers swarming like hornets, phones ringing off the hook. Reporters had already formed a wall outside her door. Inside, the mood was volatile. One aide tried handing her a phone with MSNBC on the line. She slapped it away. "What do we do?" her chief of staff asked. "We fight," she said. "We go nuclear." And that was the decision. Within the hour, Crockett went live on Instagram, her face defiant, lit in dramatic lighting, framed by the American flag on one side and a bookshelf full of progressive titles on the other. "This is what it looks like when the system fears you," she began. "A black woman stands up to the richest man in the world, and they send the FBI after her. They want to silence me because I refuse to back down." It was the same rhetoric, sharpened now into a weapon. She made no effort to address the evidence. Patel had laid out. No mention of the arson attacks. No reflection on the affidavits. Just fury. Just fire. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Elon Musk must be held accountable. If they want to come after me for saying that, then let them. Because I'm not afraid. I don't bow. The comments rolled in by the thousands. Some cheered. Others were stunned. But behind the screen, deep inside the Bureau's headquarters, Patel watched quietly from his office, not as a politician, but as an investigator. He wasn't done. On his desk sat a new file, a fresh lead, the fourth cooperating witness. Her name was Maria Alvarez, a former intern who had worked in Crockett's Dallas office. She'd requested immunity through her lawyer, and in exchange, she'd handed over something that made Patel's stomach tighten. A video file, one recorded on her phone. In the grainy footage, you could see Crockett seated at a staff table surrounded by half a dozen aides. Her voice was low but sharp. "They're scared of fire. So maybe fire's the only way we get heard. We're not gonna get anywhere waving signs and lighting candles. People gotta feel it. If we make them nervous enough, maybe they'll finally start listening." It was damning. It wasn't metaphor, it wasn't hyperbole, it was strategy. Patel pressed a button on his desk. "I need an urgent session with DOJ, priority level 1. I'm sending a file. And prepare a memo for congressional ethics. Crockett isn't just reckless, she's dangerous." But even as he moved with resolve, he knew the storm outside was accelerating. On Capitol Hill, members of the Progressive Caucus huddled in a private emergency meeting, torn between distancing themselves or closing ranks around Crockett. Some feared she was becoming a liability. Others argued she was being martyred. And somewhere in Texas, at another Tesla facility, this one just outside of Houston, an explosive device was discovered under a charging port, deactivated just minutes before detonation by a maintenance worker on routine check. Inside the wiring was a note. "This one's for Jasmine." The line was crossed. This wasn't just about Crockett anymore. It was about a contagion. A movement warped by fire, feeding on outrage, metastasizing into something neither party could fully control. By midnight, the White House had issued a rare bipartisan statement. Any elected official who incites, endorses, or enables violence, directly or indirectly, will be held fully accountable under federal law. We urge all Americans to stand united against the normalization of politicals violence. But even then, Crockett doubled down. At a hastily arranged press conference the next morning, she stood on the Capitol steps, flanked by a small but vocal group of supporters holding signs that read, "Speech is not terror," and "We stand with Jasmine." She took the mic, her voice hoarse but burning. "They're calling me a terrorist because I told the truth about Elon Musk," she said. "They're trying to lock me up for a fire I didn't start. But you know what? Maybe fire is how this broken country gets cleansed." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some supporters looked at each other nervously. Inside the FBI command center, Patel turned to his deputy. "That's it. That's the line. Get this clipped. Timestamp it. That's incitement, clear as day. Let DOJ know we're moving forward with Phase 2. His deputy nodded. "We're expecting protests, maybe even riots." Patel didn't blink. "Then we get ready." As the security alert level in D.C. elevated and Capitol Police were placed on standby, the fire Crockett had lit was now well beyond her control. Her words had evolved into code, her cause into chaos. But while the city braced for impact, Patel remained methodical. He knew the next 72 hours were critical. The DOJ's internal review was accelerating. The Senate Judiciary Committee was preparing a parallel investigation, and more witnesses were coming forward. One had flown in from Dallas, another from Houston, both requesting protection, both carrying documents. As night fell again over Washington, Patel stood alone in his office, staring out over the city. Sirens wailed in the distance. Helicopters hovered. The air was dense with the kind of quiet that only comes before everything breaks open. He turned back to his desk, closed the last file, and said quietly to no one in particular, "This isn't political anymore. This is containment." Because Crockett hadn't just broken the rules. She had shattered the barrier between rhetoric and riot. And now, the system wasn't just responding. It was preparing to strike. The morning of the final reckoning began not with a bang, but with an eerie calm. The streets of Washington, D.C. were quiet, barricaded in parts, watched over by a growing presence of federal agents, Capitol Police, and unmarked vehicles. The night before, 2 more incendiary devices had been intercepted at Tesla service centers in Colorado and New York, both packed with nails, both rigged to ignite remotely. Inside each was a note quoting Jasmine Crockett, verbatim. If we have to burn it down to be heard, then so be it. By dawn, Attorney General Lydia Connors had scheduled a live press conference. But just before that, the real confrontation happened. Not on live TV, not in the echoing halls of Congress, but behind the closed doors of the DOJ, in a room thick with tension. Kash Patel stood across from Connors, flanked by top DOJ brass, as he laid the final piece on the table. "We've confirmed it," Patel said. "There's video, audio, written testimony." Crockett didn't just inspire the attacks. She coordinated messaging with activist groups after the first dealership burned. She knew the fire had happened. She knew it was linked to her rhetoric. And she doubled down. Connors, who had served under 2 administrations, didn't blink. "Are we talking conspiracy? Material support?" Patel nodded. "At minimum, and likely obstruction." She pressured 2 former staffers to retract statements, one of whom is now under federal protection. Connors stood, paced for a moment, then turned to her deputy. "Draft the indictment. I want it airtight. No political blowback, no gaps. This isn't about silencing anyone. This is about re-establishing the line." Outside, news of the arrests in New York and Denver had already broken. Public sentiment was shifting rapidly. The line between those defending Crockett and those condemning her was beginning to blur. Even former allies in the House were backing away. 2 co-sponsors of her last bill had issued quiet statements calling her language reckless. Her inner circle was shrinking by the hour. By noon, the DOJ released its official charges. United States versus Jasmine Crockett. Charges: incitement to commit acts of domestic terrorism, obstruction of justice, conspiracy to incite violence, and abuse of public office. Crockett was arrested in her office without fanfare. Though the images, her in cuffs, head held high, still defiant, spread across the internet like wildfire. She was silent as she was escorted down the Capitol steps. No slogans, no shouts, just the cold hum of finality. Reporters shouted questions she no longer answered. Kash Patel, for his part, declined interviews. He returned to the bureau that afternoon and issued a single statement. "The rule of law doesn't bend for identity, ideology, or outrage. If you weaponize your power to justify violence, you will be held accountable. No one is immune." It wasn't eloquent, it wasn't grandiose, but it was final. Over the following weeks, the political establishment reckoned with the fallout. Crockett's allies attempted to spin her prosecution into martyrdom, but the evidence was damning and public. The footage, the messages, the chain of communications, and most devastating of all, victim statements, testimony from the injured mechanic in Phoenix, a grieving mother from Denver who had nearly lost her daughter when a charging station exploded, just blocks from a daycare, the immigrant security guard still undergoing skin grafts. Crockett's narrative couldn't survive the weight of the facts. The House Ethics Committee unanimously voted for expulsion, and within a month she was removed from office. A special election was held in her district. Her replacement, a quiet, policy-focused Democrat from Fort Worth, ran on a platform of de-escalation, unity, and rebuilding public trust. Elon Musk, for his part, kept his distance from the entire affair. He issued a single tweet in response to Crockett's arrest: "Free speech is sacred. Violence is not." Meanwhile, the FBI launched a new initiative, Directive 42, targeting politically motivated domestic threats, irrespective of party affiliation. It was controversial. It was challenged. But it passed. The public was tired of watching elected leaders play with matches while the country burned. And as for Kash Patel, his profile rose. But he didn't seek the spotlight. When asked in a rare CBS interview what drove him, he replied, "People think accountability is partisan. It's not. It's just inconvenient. But if you allow people to excuse violence under the cover of justice, it won't be long before justice itself is unrecognizable. By the time Crockett's trial began, the country had moved on. Mostly. She retained a loyal core of supporters, some who saw her as a truth-teller silenced by the establishment. But most had seen enough. The damage was real, the victims were real, and the facts were undeniable. The jury deliberated for less than 2 days. Guilty on all counts. She was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole for the first 6. Her sentencing statement was short. "I wanted to wake people up. I didn't mean for it to go this far." But it had gone that far. In the end, the story wasn't about Elon Musk, or even about Jasmine Crockett. It was about the power of words, the fragile boundary between protest and provocation, and how easily that boundary can be crossed when outrage becomes currency and identity is wielded as a shield rather than a responsibility. The fire that Crockett lit had indeed scorched the system, but not in the way she intended. It didn't spark a revolution. It sparked a reckoning. And in the ashes, a hard truth remained. Leadership isn't about volume. It's about vision. It's not measured in headlines, but in what you leave behind once the cameras turn off. Kash Patel left the bureau 2 years later. Quietly. No press tour. No memoir. He returned to law, occasionally consulting for domestic security policy. He declined all offers to run for office. "I did my part," he told a colleague. "Now let others do theirs." And as the Capitol carried on, more hearings, more bills, more crises, the story of the confrontation between Patel and Crockett faded into the history books. But every time the country teetered near that dangerous line again, someone would inevitably bring up that hearing, that moment, the one where spectacle met substance, and lost.